Welcome to the Work Trends podcast from Talent Culture. I'm your host, Megan Ambiro. Every week, I interview interesting people who are reimagining work. And be sure to check out our Work Trends Twitter chat events calendar located at talentculture.com on the podcast page. Welcome to the Talent Culture Work Trends podcast, sponsored by Accurate Background. Today, we are going to be talking about background screening in an increasingly remote-first world of work. No doubt, the pandemic has reshaped the workplace, and in many ways, it's here to stay. In fact, a report by Ladders revealed that by the end of this year, 25% of all jobs in North America are going to be remote. With that in mind, employers need to adapt their background screening practices to the new normal of remote work. Many of us have heard of the Bermuda Triangle, right? Also known as the Devil's Triangle. It's a mythical area in the western Atlantic Ocean where a number of aircraft and ships have disappeared under very mysterious circumstances. In much the same way, there is a Bermuda Triangle of background screening when it comes to your remote workforce. We invited Bon Idziak of Accurate Background to let us in on this phenomenon and tell us more about what could trip up employers when background screening. Bon Idziak, Chief Compliance and Government Relations Officer for Accurate Background, is a 25-year industry professional and subject matter expert on the topic of background screening, drug testing, and HR technology. His philosophy is minimize hiring and retention risk through the design, implementation, and management of smart, or shall I say intelligent, screening programs. He is also a past president and former member of the board of directors for the Substance Abuse Program Administrators Association, SAPAA. So welcome to the show, Bon.
Thanks so much, Megan. I'm happy to be here.
I am so excited about this podcast, so I'm just going to dive right in, okay?
Let's do it.
All right. So tell us, what are the basics every employer needs to know about background checks?
Well, I've thought a lot about this topic, and I think the best way to open the conversation today is just to remind employers that background screening is heavily regulated. I mean, we're talking federal law, Fair Credit Reporting Act, state laws, which are really in addition to responsibilities that employers have under the federal FCRA, and even local laws now that regulate employers' use of background screening information when an individual is going to be working in a certain jurisdiction. So I think you're going to hear a lot through this conversation about policy development and written procedures and how they relate to certain things. I think let's focus on the regulations and how employers can make sure that they're following them.
And let's just level set for a minute because, you know, us humans, we can be lazy. Let's get honest, right?
That's for sure.
It's the elephant in the room, us humans. Does it matter what size company you are? In context of yes, there you go. So if you're out there, Work Trends community, it doesn't matter if you're a 5-person company. If you're out there, please listen in because this is important stuff. So, Bon, what are the various types of background checks available to hiring companies?
Background screening ranges. There's a really wide variety of things that employers utilize throughout the screening process, but I think we can summarize in categories of things, right? So first, there's criminal history information, and that comes from federal courts. It comes from state courts. Sometimes there are databases that are leveraged in order to pull in criminal history and further investigate within the state or federal court systems to ensure that the reports are complete and accurate. There's a subset of things that we call verifications, and verifications range from professional license verification, employment verification, education history, and those things are really, really important for employers to understand that the individual that they're hiring for a role has the skills and competencies that are needed in order to perform the job functions and to be great at it, most importantly. And then there are things like, drug tests, and I think maybe we're going to talk a little bit about that. Always the fun topic to discuss on a podcast. And things like credit reports and driving records, those are usually done more in a job relatedness factor, right? If a person's going to be driving for work or if they've got a position in finance. But I think verifications, criminal history, drug testing, those are really the main factors that we see in background screening.
Why is having a policy in place for safeguarding employers important when you talk about all this?
Well, I would say that it's not just important, it's mandatory. I mean, the laws have become so complex. I don't want to age myself, but this is my 25th year in background screening. And I got to tell you, it was a lot less complicated 25 years ago when we were walking these background screening reports around in manila file folders, collecting information about people and then typing it up into a report.
Ooh, I'm getting the manila folders.
Ew, it's awful, right?
Ooh.
Yeah.
Sorry.
The policy piece of a background screening and drug testing program is paramount. You have to document, first off, why you're screening, right? There are many employers that are screening because there's a regulatory requirement. By law, either a state law or a federal law, they have to screen, and they're prohibited from engaging with certain individuals, for example, with certain types of criminal history or who test positive for certain types of drugs. There are also employers who are conducting background checks really to ensure the safety and integrity of the workforce. And I think that's a really important aspect to consider in a policy, right? How do we ensure, Megan, that the communities that we're in are safe and that people feel good about engaging in business with us as local business owners or even nationwide or global businesses?
Is obtaining consent from the job candidate required prior to conducting a background check? And what workaround does a hiring company have if the candidate refuses?
Great questions. Oh, it's required and it's required and it's required again, right? So, consent, I think is a really interesting topic for us to ensure that we're driving home to employers, not just the federal requirements that they have for consent related to consumer reports and investigative consumer reports. So I'm going to throw in a couple of technical terms throughout the conversation as well. That way, if someone is listening and they're taking notes and they're thinking about talking with management or even with their legal department, they've got some of these terms. But the Federal Fair Credit Reporting Act requires a disclosure that consists solely of the disclosure that's clear and conspicuous. And there's a lot of litigation around this. So employers, beware. Your disclosure is really a critical piece of the background screening process. And then that consent piece, the authorization, you've got to make sure that the authorization has the right language in it, right? And that you're making the appropriate items in that authorization to the candidate part of the background screening process. So if you're going to do a credit report, tell them you're doing a credit report. And in some states, you also have to tell them why, right? So that's layering in the state component. If you're conducting a criminal history check or you're going to be talking with personal references or professional references, put that in the authorization. Make sure it's clear. And to the extent that that authorization is going to survive the pre-employment use case in states where it's allowed, make sure that you've got that evergreen language in there too, so that if you need to conduct a background check for example, a promotion or a reassignment, you have the ability to do that throughout the person's employment. So I think that's a good summary of consent, how consent is done and why it's so important. Let's just talk about when a person refuses, right? Most employers are conducting background checks contingent offer, right? So I've made you an offer and now it's time for you to engage in the background screening process. That contingency is made clear to the candidate. So if the candidate doesn't want to authorize the background check, quite frankly, they don't move forward with the process. And employers are well within rights to leverage that, but they should certainly state it in their policy. Here we go again. Make sure that it's documented so that if it's ever questioned, you've got the right procedures in place to back up your process.
What options do we have? Because us humans, we're messy by our nature. I mean, what happens when a background check comes back as a fail on somebody who's really a great fit? They're a high potential.
That's a really good question. And yeah, I think we are a bit messy as humans. What I've learned in my 25 years in the background screening industry is that humans sometimes are capable of doing unimaginable and unspeakable things. And there's a difference, I think, between a person who might be habitual in nature related to criminal history or even drug abuse, for example, and a person who is a great person that's really just had a bad day. And that I see a lot of, right? I see a lot of, wow, there was an event in a person's life and sometimes recently that caused them to go off the rails, right? For whatever reason, they decided decided to steal something. They decided that they were going to hurt someone, and it's certainly no laughing matter. But employers are really faced with these difficult decisions, right? If a person has multiple speeding tickets, for example, or a DUI, but they're not going to be in a driving related position, how critical is it to the hiring decision that's being made? If someone, for example, has an incident of theft, right? This is a really good example, but they're never alone or unsupervised with company valuables or access to cash. How relevant is that theft conviction to the decision that the employer's hiring for? I think these are considerations that are really important. First, they're required under the EEOC guidance on the use of criminal history in hiring related decisions. So if you haven't seen that, take a good look at it. Really important to understand those green factors that the EEOC recommends in its guidance when using criminal history information, but also in ban the box laws that exist at the state and local level. And some of those ban the box laws have really strict requirements for employers where you not only have to conduct the individualized assessment that's mandated by the EEOC, but you also have to document it. And in some cases, you have to provide it to the individual who's the subject of the background check where you're going to be making the decision. Don't just assume that because a person has criminal history that they're incapable of performing the job or that they're a bad person. Give them an opportunity to provide you with things like statements of rehabilitation or information related to the offense itself, right? What actually happened? And do I want to take that into consideration when I'm making a hiring decision? And I'll tell you, employers that do that, they have a successful relationship with those candidates, and candidates who are second chance or re-entering the workforce that have those opportunities are so hardworking and grateful for them when it's possible to engage. So that was a lot. We just unpacked a lot.
Have you taken a breath? Because I think you need to.
Well, I mean, listen, you've given me limited time for this podcast, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I have two words: social media.
Oh my goodness, absolutely.
Like OMG.
My older self is speaking to my younger self.
And what is it telling you? This is huge. I mean, is it acceptable or ethical for companies to be scrutinizing social media? And what are some of those pitfalls that we need to avoid?
First and foremost, employers, hear me now. Do not go on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or even LinkedIn and look at the posts of your candidates yourself. That's a big mistake. You want to engage with a professional organization who is doing this in a manner that is consistent with EEOC guidelines, that's going to apply a set of rules to ensure that you're shielded from any sort of discrimination related to images or posts that might be religious in nature or that lead to a person's political beliefs. I could go on and on and on about why it's so critical that employers just don't go out and do it themselves. In fact, I think the trends early on with social media is that employers were doing that. In fact, I myself may be guilty of having done it at some point in the past.
If everybody's being honest today, who hasn't?
Right. Well,
that's really the question.
Not only are we messy, Megan, but we're also curious, aren't we?
There you go.
Really curious. A professional social media screen is going to bring you back information about, whether or not a person is engaged in activities that could be potentially harmful to the brand or present a risk to the organization. And those are things that are really focused on in social media screening. That is what a company that does this is going to bring to you so that you can make a decision that is ultimately about the true risk to the company and not just a personal opinion that you may have about someone or some sort of unconscious bias that you would otherwise be applying to activities that a person may be engaged in.
Another one word, marijuana. And, I happen to be podcasting today from Portland, Oregon, and it's quite popular here and it's legal and it's starting to become legal, obviously, in many other states. And I think that's just going to continue to grow. I mean, obviously, it's a hot topic. I mean, what should the potential employer be cautious of here? And what is acceptable to ask in the instance that marijuana use is found?
That's a great question. And quite frankly, we could do a podcast just about marijuana and legalization and what does that look like and what do employers do? And most importantly, I think what do candidates do when it's a legal situation? I think there are a couple of considerations to make. First off, there are still federal laws and federal mandates in place for drug testing existing, where it doesn't matter what the state law, it doesn't matter if it's legal recreational use, federal law prohibits it. Still a Schedule I drug under federal law. And if you are an employer in a federally regulated environment and your drug screening candidates, that marijuana use, whether it's legal or not, really is impermissible. And so that's kind of the first set of laws that we look at, right? So, Nuclear Regulatory Commission and Department of Defense and Department of Transportation. So that's truck drivers and bus drivers and airplane pilots, pipeline operators. Those are all sections or sectors, right, that are regulated under federal law, where marijuana, quite frankly, is still prohibited regardless of what the state law says. I think the second consideration is that an employer under any law where marijuana is legal does not have to accommodate use in the workplace. And that means a person getting high before they come to work. There are lots of state laws now that are emerging or that are currently in place related to whether or not you can test for marijuana pre-employment, or whether you can use a positive test result for marijuana in an employment-related decision. But each one of those also has exemptions. So there are safety-sensitive role exemptions, and those definitions of safety-sensitive can be very narrow. They can be very broad. So I think those are the three things. Are you federally regulated? And does the Schedule I regulation of marijuana use and other drugs, of course, apply? There's the second consideration, which is that employers do not have to accommodate workplace use of marijuana. So you can't be high and go to work. It presents a risk, just like you can't be drunk and go to work. It's not a great idea, and it presents problems, safety issues, and other issues for employers. And then the third consideration is, what does the actual law state at the state level or the local level around permissibility of use and the safety sensitive nature of a role when it relates to the actual testing for marijuana? So big ups for employers regarding marijuana use, and where individuals are able to enjoy marijuana under state law currently or under a local law. Great. It's great that you're able to do so. Just don't do it and come to work.
Well, I mean, we could talk for hours and hours because you're just a fascinating person with tons of ideas and knowledge, but
flattery will get you everywhere.
See? But you know what? I don't want to throw a monkey wrench into it, but I got to get real. But a lot of us, not all of us, but many of us are working remotely, right?
Yeah.
Like, talk about a big topic. Actually, we should do another podcast that just talks about that subject, right? Remote work. So there you go. Any final thoughts for us today?
I don't think that anyone really ever anticipated that it would be possible to be productive in a remote work environment the way that we have embraced it over the past 2 years. I think if you had asked me 5 years ago, was it possible in the background screening industry, for example, for our employees to work from home and for us to still provide a high quality, low turnaround time background check report that is decisional for employers in the same capacity that we do in an office environment where everyone is thriving and the energy is high? And I would have said it can't be done. And I'm now happy to take a step back from that and say, wow, we have really proven in every industry, right? Banking, so heavily regulated. I just went through a mortgage refinance process myself, and every person that was involved in the process was working from home. And I was scratching my head thinking about privacy and personally identifying information. I think those are the things that employers really have to think about when you're looking at a background check result, for example, and there are risk factors that are present on the report for the individual, but they're going to be unsupervised, and there are very little controls that employers can impose around the environment. Then I think you have to take some additional due diligence to ensure that the people that you're hiring, A, that you know who they are, B, that they've done what they say they have done, C, that there's nothing within that risk profile, here we go with social media again, right, that is going to be destructive to the employer's brand. And, maybe the final thought is that they're not sitting at home smoking on the bong while they're typing away on their laptop.
There you go. I mean, on that note, thank you for stopping by today, Bon. This has been awesome.
It was a lot of fun for me. I hope you have me again. I've really enjoyed this, and I hope that we've given some employers good food for thought and certainly some takeaways from the conversation today.
Thanks for listening to the Work Trends Podcast, your favorite source for all that's new and exciting in the world of work. If you enjoy what we do here, do me a favor, share it. And don't forget to tune in for our next episode. Catch up with you next time. Thanks to listening to Work Trends from Talent Culture. Join us every Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern for a live Twitter chat with our podcast guest. To learn more about guests featured on today's show, visit the show notes for this episode at talentculture.com and help us spread the word. Subscribe to Work Trends wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave us a rating, review in iTunes. Share Work Trends with your coworkers, your friends. Look forward to it. See you next time.